Okay. Hi. I'd like to talk with you about American relations with Iran. Given the current history of Iran, and given especially the problematic relationships between the United States and Iran, and the fact that Iran has splashed itself on the main cover of many magazines and TV news in the last couple of weeks, with many protests and problems and deaths, we can lose sight of the fact that at one time the United States and Americans had a very positive relationship with Iran earlier in Iran's history. In fact, one could argue that the United States and certain Americans played a major role in the development of modern Iran, and particularly in the development of Persian nationalism. Now, I do want to give some caution here as we talk about this. I certainly don't want to claim that the United States and Americans were necessarily the major reason behind the development of modern Iran and Persian nationalism. There were many factors in the back of that. And at some time we may talk about that. So I want to make that very clear. But at the same time, it's important to point out a few things. Let's begin in 1851. Now, you might wonder, why 1851? Well, at that time, the Persian government, at that time Iran was called Persia, and retained that name until the first member of the Pahlavi dynasty in the 1930s, when it adopted the modern name of Iran. And you might, as a side note, the modern name Iran came about because of relationships with Nazi Germany. Interestingly enough, that the Shah chose as a title for Iran a word that essentially means Aryan. Think of Aryan racial supremacy. But that's a whole nother topic. 1851. That's when the Qajar, K-A-J-A-R dynasty, decided to create an institution of higher learning, Dar al-funun. It's spelled, Dar essentially means gate, D-A-R, A-L-F-U-N-U-N, in transliteration into English. It was to be a school for elite in Iran, especially males, almost all males. And the purpose was to educate them to be better equipped to exercise leadership in a variety of fields in Iran. Now, where's the American connection? The American connection is that the Grand Vizier, second in command, chose as his model the developing concept of land grant colleges in the United States, such as Purdue, for example, in Indiana. Their model was to create institutions intimately connected with the community to bring about economic development and leadership in a variety of fields, especially technical fields, vocational fields. And this school of higher learning was to turn out for decades many of the important leaders of modern Iran. So right away, there's an important connection. Now, diplomatic relations with the United States were not really established until the 1880s. Nonetheless, there was a trickle of Americans beginning as early as 1830s who would come to Iran, we'll call it Iran, for a variety of reasons. Probably one of the most important of those leaders was Dr. Samuel Martin Jordan, who came as early as 1898 and stayed there until 1941 during World War II. Sources indicate that in many ways he can be called the father, no less, the father of modern Iranian education. He became principal of the American High School in Tehran, and eventually also principal of the American College in Tehran. Those schools turned out thousands of graduates who went on to many different fields in Iran. And this school played a major role in the development of modern Iran. You might also be interested in a woman by the name of Jane Doolittle, who played a similar role for decades in Iran, especially in health and education, and came there in 1921 and stayed and eventually retired in 1964, though she remained in Iran until the revolution in 1979. Individuals like this created a very positive image in Iran of Americans and of American institutions. It's worth reminding ourselves of this. Another way in which the United States influenced Iran, besides the field of education, which is considerable in its own right, would be in the development of the modern Constitution of Iran, developed in 1907. When the Qajar dynasty, under pressure from many forces within Iran, decided to develop a constitutional monarchy, they looked in their constitutional development, in part to Great Britain, of course, but also to the United States in creating a checks and balances system. So the United States, in a variety of ways, has played a significant role in the development of education, of constitutional government, and of institutional life in Iran. I'd like to add to that President Franklin Roosevelt. President Franklin Roosevelt traveled to Tehran in 1943, where he met with Churchill and also the Soviet dictator Stalin at the famous Tehran Conference. And while their focus, of course, was on the main issues and problems of World War II, he was able to get from the British and the Soviets a commitment to the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of the government of Iran. In other words, that Iran would not be dismembered. And this was a significant commitment because the government of Iran had cozied up to Nazi Germany. I alluded to this earlier. Because of their interest in the Nazi government and in the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. And it invited many, many advisors into Iran, doing away, for example, with the Boy Scouts and creating a version of the Hitler Youth, no less, in Iran. So there would have been great temptation during World War II to carve up Iran. And in fact, American forces were there, along with British and Soviet, and Iran became a major conduit for Lend-Lease during World War II. So in the background here, we could argue that the United States played a major role in securing the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Iran. It is a sad commentary that the United States itself did not follow through on this when the CIA, in cooperation with the British, overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran, the Mossadegh government. Iranians remember this well. Very few Americans have ever heard of it. So up until at least 1950s, the United States had a positive background with Iran. One hopes, indeed, in the midst of the current crisis, that we might be able to resurrect those good relationships if the current regime can moderate or certainly change. So I thank you for listening, and I hope you just enjoyed this discussion.